My name is Jasper Collier, and I'm the Deputy Director of Programs at Humanities DC, and we're here to talk about the pandemic pivot that a lot of public humanities organizations experienced over the course of the spring and summer of this year. Humanities DC is the State Humanities Council for Washington, DC, one of 56 local nonprofit affiliates of the National Endowment for the Humanities. Founded in 1980, our mission is to enrich the quality of life, foster intellectual stimulation, and promote cross-cultural understanding and appreciation of local history in all neighborhoods of the district through humanities programs and grants. When shutdowns and restrictions due to the COVID-19 pandemic went into force last March, Humanities DC was supporting 46 public humanities projects across the city, including 15 oral history projects that had just received their notices of funding that month. We extended upcoming application and reporting deadlines, awarded 36 grants to public humanities organizations through the CARES Act, and endeavored to offer advice and support to grantees in whatever forms we could. In the midst of the pandemic, we continue to award project grants, and we're constantly amazed by applicants' creative adaptations and their determination to continue serving their audiences, in some cases expanding services to reflect the needs of their communities. Today, I'm pleased to introduce 5 project directors who exemplify those efforts. While I don't think anyone could have faulted them for postponing their projects, turning inward, and devoting 2020 to research and planning, all of them continued or continue to realize the projects they outlined in their original applications, albeit adapted in enhanced forms. Rasha Abdulhadi is the executive director at Split This Rock. Split This Rock was awarded a Soul of the City grant for youth programming in 2019 for their poetry programs. Jewel Addy is the Director of Communications at Whitman Walker Health. She's worked on several grant projects as part of the DC Oral History Collaborative and received a DCOHC Public Projects and Events grant in March. Flanora Merritt is a high school educator and webmaster at Friendship Charter Schools. Her team was awarded a 2020 Humanities Vision grant for a student-produced film called Fading Color: How Gentrification is Causing the Disappearance of DC's Black Community. Akua Kuyate is the project director on a 2020 DC Oral History Collaborative oral history project called The Day Arthur Ashe and Robert Kennedy Played Tennis on Our Block. And Nicholas Linner is a filmmaker who received a grant in 2019 to produce a documentary film on the rapid redevelopment of Washington, DC's Florida Avenue Market site. Each panelist will discuss their project and some of the changes they made to their project's delivery content, or in some cases both. After those presentations, we'll leave ample time to turn to audience questions. I would like to acknowledge the outstanding work of Humanities DC staff and consultants, including Dr. Anna Kaplan and Maggie Lemire, who provided guidance and training to the DC Oral History Collaborative project directors, and my colleague at Humanities DC and co-chair for this panel, grants manager Andrea McNeil. Andrea has been responsible for providing advice and support to existing grantees and for recruiting applicants in the midst of the pandemic, helping them think through key changes to their programming and encouraging them to apply. I'll turn things over to Andrea now so she can talk a bit about those efforts before we turn to our panelists. Thanks, Andrea.
Good morning, all. So the pandemic. So I think initially, from an approach perspective, I didn't have one. And I think a lot of people did not have one. There was no playbook for continuing our services, for continuing our projects, and definitely not finalizing and ending our grants and for a final product. So I just really try to look at things from a human perspective. Yes, I am at work. I am a grants manager. We had deadlines, there was funding out there, but I just felt like we need to take a pause and really look and see what is going on with our grantees, because they are human. They have families, schools shut down all at once. People packed up their things from their offices. And guess what? COVID was real around the country. So within 2 weeks of a week of shutting down our offices, I am from Detroit. So Detroit was one of the areas that was heavily hit by the pandemic very early on. There was a super spreader event. Nobody had even heard of the term super spreader just in our lifetime, right? So there were a couple of events they hadn't even figured these things out yet, but there was great loss very early on. And so it was kind of a trifecta going on. And so I just wanted to make certain, because I felt differently every day and wanted to make sure how my grantees felt very early on. And then we had reporting. As Jasper mentioned, we did adjust some grant deadlines, some reporting deadlines, but I also wanted to know really what was going on the ground so that we can make decisions. I didn't just want to say, okay, let's push this date back 2 weeks just because there's a pandemic, but what is really going on with our grantees? Some of the grantees had out of time school programs. So with no school, and I'll let Rasha go into that, but some of them became social service workers. That's not what they were. They were program coordinators. They were in schools to help students with a particular program. But I know that they looked at, are you okay? Do you have food? And kind of doing a checklist for our students. Some of our film projects, they halted completely, because guess what? When you're filming, you have a group of people that are very close and strangers with documentaries, and nobody wanted to talk to anybody at that time. So I had to take a look at all of those things when speaking to my grantees, and just leveling the expectation and understanding we would get there, but right now is not really the time to push because we're all trying to figure it out. I think that as time went on, people found a space and began to figure it out. But that took some weeks, and we just kind of came together. I put everybody together on each of my grants on a group call so that everybody could talk, because there may have been some nuggets that somebody else had to share. And I think those were great opportunities as well. I mean, I think, again, I wanted to know what was going on. So the only way to do that was to constantly communicate with everyone and understand their challenges. I know that is not always looked at as a positive thing when you're reporting on your grant, but this to me was a little bit different so that we could really figure out where we needed to go from there. Then we had a new grant cycle coming in. And so Jasper and I, we had conversations, should these happen? What are we doing? And what we did know and realize is that people were in need. So people were being laid off. We have filmmakers. If there were other day jobs, those things were not happening. And so these funds would keep a lifeline for some people, and we would just have to figure out how to get them done. We asked additional questions on some of the grant applications. So for new youth programming, we really wanted to look at recruitment and engagement, because recruitment, you can get kids to sign up for things all day, but how do we keep them engaged during a pandemic? They're on school all day online, and then you're asking them again to be online, because again, nothing's really changed since March. I know some schools have been in session, but for out of time programs, especially with DC public schools, that access has been very much limited. And so looking at all that, and then just in general, I think putting people first has been my approach in pivoting in the pandemic. And then things have really, they have fallen in place because of our hard work and grantees that, again, Jasper said they could have thrown in the towel, but they were really, really dedicated to the services that they were providing, to the people that they were providing those services to, and continue to be. So thank you guys for that. But if you have any questions, you can just put them in the chat and we will move over and turn it over to Rasha.
Thank you so much, Jasper and Andrea. It's a pleasure to be invited here today. As Jasper mentioned, I am currently serving as the executive director at Split This Rock, which is a social justice and poetry organization. When we were in our offices were based in the DuPont Circle area, but we had teaching artists working in more than a dozen schools across the sort of DC, Maryland, and Virginia area. We in multiple wards in the city, and we were in the middle of a Soul of the City grant. So we weren't a new applicant, but we were sort of in full swing with our programs when the pandemic happened. So we had some major adjustments to make. There were some of the bigger kinds of convenings and festivals that we would normally have hosted in a regular year that we were not able to continue with, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. And then there were some other programs we were able to adapt and create virtual versions of, or really think of alternatives that we could host at either smaller scales or in an online setting that would allow us to maintain those kinds of connections to community that for our staff we assessed was going to be really important during this time. So I'll give you a little bit of an overview of some of the pivots that we faced as an organization. And some of these were directly part of our proposal for the Soul of the City partnership, but some of them were just for us as an organization to give you an idea of the context we were in. So Split This Rock hosts a national poetry festival. It is DC's only poetry festival. And we host it every 2 years. 2020 was supposed to be our year to host it. And it was going to be in late March of this year. So we made a call just a few days ahead of the DC mayor's declaration of a state of emergency in March that we were going to be postponing the festival and that we would move some things online, and there were some things we would probably need to cancel. So we did end up canceling that in-person festival. We moved some components online, including featured readings. We were really committed to paying featured artists. And that also included Youth Poets Laureate from the National Youth Poets Laureate program, because we wanted to be able to feature and honor youth poets as part of connecting those national programs to our local youth programs. We sponsored a virtual book fair. We held a virtual open mic. And things like our ongoing week-to-week programs, our Poem of the Week, which is a social justice themed poem that goes out to our listserv of 9,000 plus people nationally, continued to go out. So we were working on all these curation projects. We had been hosting, and part of the expansion that we offered through the Soul of the City partnership was expanding our writing workshops to be not just once every other week, so not just 2 writing workshops a month, but really what ended up being 6 writing workshops a month. So our 2 general audience writing workshops a month, and then during the pandemic, we expanded to every week hosting an online youth writing workshop. That was really exciting. Those ended up being really intimate and gave us a chance to work with alternating weeks with a general audience of youth who could attend, and then on 2 weeks out of the month to work with the DC Youth Slam team. We were able to adapt. Another event that was scheduled to happen in March was the DC Youth Slam team Grand Slam Finals. We had hosted qualifiers, and this was part of our Soul of the City partnership. We had hosted qualifying events for high school, for teenage poets. So some of them were early college students as well, but primarily high school students in the DC area, dating back as far as December, and then events in January and February. And then when we got to the time of the finals in March, we were already in shutdown mode, city and region wide. So we did adapt sort of an intimate version of that. And that was so exciting and beautiful to be a part of, especially early on in the pandemic, and to have an opportunity for youth poets to record their poems and then be able to receive judges scoring, to be able to receive cheers in a virtual Zoom space with both their teachers and teaching artists and their peers. It was really exciting. So it was an early test to see what it would be like to host what would normally be a main stage event for us at arena stages or at some other big venue, and adapt some part of it. We didn't make it a big public invitation because it was so early on in the pandemic, and we wanted to make sure that we had the technical parts of it right. And we really wanted to, as Andrea said, really prioritize the relationships. And I do appreciate that HumanitiesDC has been really supportive of us in doing that. The team continued to meet weekly. We also prioritized wanting to pay our teaching artists. So we were at the end of what would have been our school year in sort of March when we were closing down. So we had to temporarily suspend the teaching artist programs because we didn't have work for them to do in April and May. And that's where we shifted a little bit more into sort of social service mode, particularly for our teaching artists, to really find as many bridges as we could to them for emergency funding, support them with applications, get them access to the expanded unemployment opportunities for gig workers. And then when we were able to know that we had emergency funding, including some of the CARES Act funding from Humanities DC, over the summer, we were able to expand more hours for the teaching artists than we would normally have offered them during the summer. And so that was an attempt to really make up for the money that we couldn't pay them in April and May. So those kinds of commitments to our people has been really important during this time. We want to make sure that we still have teaching artists to work with when we're ready to open back up. We want to make sure we still have featured poets who are able to still dedicate time to their craft. Things that we still are uncertain about how we might adapt are some of these bigger events. Split This Rock usually hosts these sort of 3 main stage youth programming events every year. There's a team competition that we would normally, an individual competition we would normally have been hosting at this time in the fall. And then there's a team competition we would normally host in the spring. Those are things that we're reassessing, and we're taking a quarterly approach to reassessing our programs. So we're trying to see budget-wise, staff capacity-wise, and then, as we're seeing right now, the conditions of the pandemic are changing again. So we are going to see probably some rolling shutdowns and closures in different areas nationwide, and that is something that we could have maybe a little bit foreseen 3 months ago, but is more clear to us now, and I think is going to definitely affect our January to March programming. I want to make sure that I don't take up too much time now so that everyone else can present and we'll have time for discussion. But I definitely have a lot more thoughts about things that we've adapted to provide more accessibility services, which have always been a priority for us, but really trying to do our best to model that during this time when so many folks are doing virtual programming. So yeah, I'm excited to listen to other folks and then to get into the discussion today, but I'll pause for now. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jewel Addy. Thank you so much for sharing, Rasha. We love Split This Rock at Whitman Walker. So my name is Jewel. I work at Whitman Walker Health as Director of Communications in the External Affairs Department. And Whitman Walker has been grateful to be 2017 and 2019 grantees of the DC Oral History Collaborative. Through those grants, we were able to build up our collection to about 18 oral histories. And that work really planted a seed for other projects like 40 Stories for 40 Years, where we honored our 40th anniversary through a mixed media digital storytelling campaign, and also got to produce a 40th anniversary documentary that year in collaboration with DC TV here in the district. So in applying for the 2020 DC Oral History Collaborative grant, we had done it from a perspective of young people have never experienced a public health emergency before. Only people who lived through the AIDS epidemic would really have any insight to offer. Like, let's kind of get these 2 groups together and do some educational exchange. So that's kind of where we wrote it from at the time. And then that was January, and then February started to happen, and then March started to happen, and then we were all closed down for COVID-19. So kind of a big pivot to change, but also a really cool thing where there's this, I guess not so cool, but there's some harmony between these public health emergencies, just in the ways that public health emergencies play out between when you first learn about the virus or the infection and how people get tested and learn information about it. So there was cool parallels to draw there. In applying for this grant, just a little bit of backtracking. So in 2015, Whitman Walker opened up a new health facility on 14th and P Street. We moved our 14th and R Street health services down 2 blocks. But we'd been in that 14th and R Street location called the Elizabeth Taylor Medical Center since 1993. So while we were in that space, we went from helping people die with dignity to helping them live, because the first kind of HIV treatments that started to work were released in 1996. So that space is just really hallowed ground. We redeveloped it in 2017 and opened it up in 2019. And with that space, what used to be the Elizabeth Taylor Medical Center lobby, we turned it into a cultural center called the Corner D.C. So This space just opened up earlier this year. We had an exhibition in it that wasn't produced in-house, but we thought for our first in-house production, we wanted to really honor Whitman Walker's history and pay some homage to that hallowed ground. And so that's kind of where we wanted to pull that element and then this oral history work and this work to kind of make the collection more public and more engaging with the community by helping artists and community kind of react to the oral history and Whitman Walker's private archive and produce pieces of work to be this art exhibition. So in doing so, we pivoted a bit. We had really envisioned elders and young people engaging together in person in the space of the corner. With COVID-19, that didn't really happen too much, but we were able to kind of send our art educators out, into community and have them go to the Wanda Alston Foundation's LGBTQ Youth Services Program and kind of have them listen to oral histories, have them engage with some of our archive material and produce their own pieces of work to be included in the show. We also pulled from our youth services program some of the art pieces that they collected and produced over the years through some of our art therapy sessions throughout the week. It's just our natural programming and include those in the show as well. We also engaged some photographers who have been really important to kind of capturing LGBTQ life over the years. So we've got some photography from Jeb, also known as Joni Byron, who's done a lot of kind of lesbian focused photography over the years. We've gotten Sharon Farmer to be in the show as well. She was the first Black woman, and I think just Black person, press photo photographer for the White House under the Clinton administration, as well as Lee Mosley. So they're kind of helping to piece together some of the DC queer life through photographs with the focus on like Black and lesbian life and some of the marches over the years for LGBTQ rights. We also commissioned some new pieces, but everyone who kind of produced these works were invited to either engage with the archive and the oral history collection and as their inspiration. So I think this project has a lot of moving parts. We're kind of in that final home stretch of getting everything together and in place. I was telling Jasper that it's still pretty raw, if you will, but we do open right after Thanksgiving. And so we're excited to get people in the room. My colleagues are actively in the corner space, hanging art each day, and just make sure everything's ready for that final launch. When I had first spoken to one of our grant project directors, Maggie, just for some support, she was like, part of this grant is really helping people engage with the archive for a long time. So we want to think about what we could do beyond just the exhibition that would kind of stand in place and for a moment in time. So we are working to make that exhibition available digitally. So folks who can't see it in person for COVID-19 restrictions or what have you, they can see it online. And then the final piece is a microsite that kind of houses all of these different pieces of Whitman Walker's history over the years, all on one page. So you'll be able to access the 40 Stories collection and our documentary and kind of go through the exhibit, as well as kind of see some of the guides for how certain pieces of workshops worked. So you can implement it yourself as you listen to the oral histories and engage with the Whitman Walker history. What else is there? I think some of the lessons learned from this, a lot of, communication, I think is really reliant on how, like what medium you use and how people receive it. So I think looking back, I would definitely kind of push to learn more about my colleagues and what effective communications channels work best for them, just so that you always make sure that things aren't getting lost in translation or lost over email. And we're all super zoomed out. So just honoring that and kind of picking up the phone when necessary or when that makes the most sense. We've done a lot of FaceTime as well. Sometimes, for whatever reason, it feels better than Zoom sometimes. We're also in a very creative focused project, an artistic focused project. So always kind of checking your gut around what feels good and what feels like it properly honors the history and making sure that you're kind of sharing that feedback appropriately. Thoughtfully project planning and sharing lots of dates and schedules early on so that everyone's on the same page around deliverables and kind of what timeline we need to stick to for reach that final goal altogether. And of course, just breathing, because there's been so much going on in the world, like left and right in 2020. Outside of this project, Whitman Walker is still a public health organization. We've been around for more than 40 years. We kind of stood up a telehealth clinic within 72 hours after COVID-19 first started to strike in March in the US. I've been doing COVID-19 testing since then. And so I still have my health center related duties between signage and messaging and whatnot. And so kind of really just staying focused and being flexible for any new news. It's super exciting that we have a vaccine in the works finally. One of the pieces that we actually got for the show is also from a narrator who kind of, I guess, listened to his oral history, but then also kind of spoke and drew parallels between kind of COVID-19 vaccine access and just the work towards that, and how he had his own experiences of trying to engage with research for HIV just based off of losing people in his family to HIV, and what that looks like in terms of stigma in his life and how that played out. But in the interest of time, I think I'll save anything else for the questions at the end, and thank you all so much for being here.
Wow, I'm so excited to be on this panel and to be among other creatives. I mean, I'm flabbergasted. I hope that we could exchange contact afterwards and stay in touch. So again, my name is Flanora Merritt. I am the advisor for Friendship News Network. And we were still fortunate to still work on our gentrification documentary, Fading Color. It's something that we've been working on for a little bit, and my students like really gravitated toward this project. So when the pandemic first hit, we were all kind of flabbergasted. Majority of the students I've been working with on the project are seniors, so the emotional aspect, a lot of their events got canceled, like they didn't have a prom or a traditional graduation. So we were all just, in a very low place. But when we got the news that we received the grant, I saw the spark return, in them. Like they started to like, wow, like we did that. So we were really ready to do this and really bring this project home. So if I could just share my screen real quick, just kind of go over what we had to do to really make this happen. So some overall challenges, of course, sharing files, missing B-roll and photos, daily communication, changing project goals, and learning Zoom and other web applications. Originally, we wanted to make this a docu-series, 3 episodes that focus on the causation, how we lost our color, 2 Ends of the Spectrum, which focuses on the pros and cons of gentrification, and how to restore our color, which focuses on the solution, like how can we reverse this if possible. But because of the pandemic, we wasn't sure if we could do full 3 episodes. So we decided to make these, combine it all into one documentary and have it in serve as chapters. I've been using Google Classroom even before the pandemic hit. So this was so perfect to like keep in communication with students. They had a built-in Google Meet link, and I'm able to post like what they're responsible for doing that day. So I can even assign individual tasks to specific students. So I told my students, like, whatever you see in your Google Stream, that's what you have to turn in. And these are my students, my babies. Each student reporter was given a Chromebook to do research, and my video editors, they were given MacBooks with backup drive. Fortunately, with my Friendship Collegiate Academy, they were so awesome with providing Chromebooks and distributing the equipment, so I'm really grateful for them. So missing B-roll. So we actually recorded a lot, done a lot of interviews and recorded, different parts of the city, but there were some things that I wanted to kind of retake, and we realized that as we were doing research, we realized that there were more places that we need to hit that was deeply affected by gentrification, like Brooklyn Manor, um, and a couple of like other places in Navy Yard. But unfortunately, I heard on the news on CNN that we were getting 100,000 new cases nationwide. I was like, okay, well, we can't go out and do B-roll. So we were just looking through our gallery. We were checking social media. We were checking what we had in our personal like phones. Um, we were looking through old news clips and news videos that we did in the past to see if it could work. And it actually turned out, pretty great. I really do like using some of the things that we've seen on social media to help tell our story, because I think that really helps humanize this story about displacement. Oh no. Okay, so Canva to the rescue. So building our storyboards. So we enlisted the expert advice of Kelly Amos, who's a professional filmmaker. She's currently she also doing a project on gentrification, but in Oakland. So we really needed her advice on, and just to make sure that we're on the right track, or how we could like build this story, but to make sure that she'd be able to see it. So we used Canva, and I broke my team into 3 groups based on the chapters. So right here, this focuses on the causation. With Canva, not only can you embed photos, you can also embed like YouTube videos. So I had my students like edit some clips and then upload it to YouTube to embed into Canva. So this is just some sample work. They did a lot more than this, but I'm very fortunate that we had this tool on hand. It took a bit of learning. It was a bit confusing to learn at first, but we figured it out. So despite everything that was going on with the pandemic, I was very proud of my students that we were still able to persevere despite the challenges. And we are going to continue to work on it and hopefully finish it by spring. Even though they're in college now, they still have the equipment with them, and we'll be resuming. So I'll make sure to invite you guys to our premiere.
Good morning. I'm Akua Kuyate. I'm next in this panel. Nice to be with all of you here. I hope you are hearing me, and let me know if there's any problem if you don't hear me. And our project is the day Arthur Ashe and Robert Kennedy played tennis on our block. And some of you may be aware of this kind of, I guess what I would say is a moment in history. Some people are aware of it, some people are not. But we chose this particular moment because it was a somewhat obscure moment, however, a very important moment to reflect on a community in Ward 6 of Washington, D.C., that actually has been a really thriving African American cultural, civic, social engagement community, spanning more than 6 decades and 5 generations. With many of the families who moved in that community in the 40s, and like many other communities across the country, at this point, most of those families are not there. There are still a few who are there. However, the importance of what this community was for Washington, D.C., being able to actually be a part of this particular event. So we wanted to target in on one aspect of this multi-generational community that would give kind of a snapshot of what really manifested in terms of the culture of the community, the engagement of the people of the community, the multi-generational transfer of information and knowledge and activity, and the civic engagement especially. When you think about this event happened in 1967, and you might find an article in an old article about it, but you really don't understand why did it happen on this block and what was the dynamic of this block that made it possible for it to happen. And so really in this process, we were interviewing generations of actually 8 interviews with individuals who lived in this community, their families. Unfortunately, the family members who first purchased homes in this block, that generation is no longer here. All of our interviewees, however, are over 60 years old. And so, of course, when you think about the pandemic, that was one of the first things that we thought about. Oh my goodness, how are we going to connect with our interviewees, our narrators? And what's very fortunate for us is that because, as I said, this was a very multi-generational relationship that spanned over 6 generations, the people in this community, although they do not all still live there, are still very connected. So because of that, we had the fortune of still being able to make the commitment of interviewing the 8 people on this first phase of this project. We had to change how we were going to interview. It was interesting that in our workshops moving in the beginning of the project, and I may have not said, but this is our first time being a grantee, there was so much discussion about the importance of that face-to-face relationship and opportunity. Well, the pandemic said, no, you can't have that. And so immediately, the beauty is that we did have connection with 1 or 2 people who we could in fact do face to face because again we're such a close knit community, and so it was possible to do that. But we were able to utilize cell phones was the biggest piece. Cell phones along with the recorders, some Zoom, to really connect with people. Someone mentioned about communication. That was really key in terms of not simply utilizing email, but calling someone up on the phone, talking to them just over and over just to stay connected, because it was a time when, quite frankly, many of the narrators who, as I said, were over 60 years old are not necessarily seeing each other. So we had an opportunity to connect with people who have not talked to each other, some of them in quite some time, that were really excited about reconnecting. And so utilizing the phone, cell phones and Zoom when we could, and the recorder to make those connections was a really critical moment for us. It was also one of the things that we were very fortunate to do, again, utilizing the technology, again, Zoom and the recorder and cell phones. We were able to gather to do a group discussion. And 6 of our 8 narrators were part of that, along with the team. It's 3 of us who are a part of the team. I'm sorry, 4 of us who are part of the team. And I should say 4 of the team members were also, 2 of the team members were also part of the narrators. So that was really great too. But what that did, it was kind of a homecoming over the phone and over Zoom, where different generations, and I say that really clearly in the sense of generational difference is not simply parent and the next child, but it's also about the siblings and the distance and the ages, because literally we had people on the phone who were 10 years older, 20 years older, and they were still part of the sibling relationships of some of the people who were on the phone. And so being able to talk to someone who was born in the 40s versus born in the 50s, and what that meant for them in terms of this community inside of the 60s and what was happening, that dynamic. So that was a real critical moment for us, because one of the things that we had talked about early on was, can you do in an oral history? Can you do a gathering? Can you actually record in a group? And yes, we could. We were fortunate that, again, the dynamic of the people themselves and who they were allowed us to have this group conversation that was so important for us, that we are continuing to look forward to how we can have another group conversation, a group gathering, to go a little further in the discussion, to invite others who were not a part of the discussion, because this was a small group, to let folks know what we're doing with this project. Because again, while that moment in history is one moment, and it certainly is an important moment, it really is about the community and the fact that this community of people, even though they all do not continue to live, and I did say at least three or four of these families are still in that community. And this is a community where literally every single house, and I would say more than 100 houses, across the street, both streets, where there were all African American families living in these communities. And now it's changed rapidly for many reasons, but there's still these few families who have been there since the 40s and continue to live there. And so we're looking to the future, very close future, about how we can gather people via technology, again, a Zoom meeting, etc., because we were also very much looking forward to coming together as a group and getting together and having this exchange and sharing this information. I do really realize that in this process, again, because we are such a new project, we were fortunate to be able to shift very quickly, and because of the connections that we have, be able to continue the work. However, we have found that the demand and the request from the narrators to, let's get together. How can we come together? How can we bring more of the community together, is something that we're really focusing on. So we really want to figure out, of course, and with the technology, to do another gathering to share out more about the project. But then how do we move forward beyond? And when is that opportunity where we can start to bring others into the project, who are maybe newer, I will say newer members of this community, so that they have a real grasp and sense of what this community is all about. So thinking about that now, with the idea of where we are now in time and how we can use the technology now versus hopefully in another time in the future when we will be able to have a face-to-face gathering. That's something that's really important to us. I would say that, as many of you said, for the team, it meant a lot more time investment in what they had to do because of the levels of communication, the email, the phone calls, the working out the technology, the actually giving some of the narrators some technical support in how to utilize the technology, because it wasn't something that they did on a regular basis. Some did, some did not. So these were important pieces, even for our team, to really know how to utilize it in a way that we could really connect with each other. So we're really excited about the future of it. And one of the bigger parts, I did miss one thing, is that initially we had thought we were going to do a lot of videotape. One of our team members is a videographer and photographer. Well, we realized early on in the project discussions and the meetings that that could be a really expensive process that could really eat away to our ability to connect with people. And why not use the energy of still photography and what that does, because that's a whole nother dynamic. And so we're in the process of taking photos of each of the narrators from a distance, socially distanced relationship of the current time, where they are now and here. And we've asked all of our narrators to contribute a photograph from the period of time, so that that would be, that juxtaposition of those narrators and in that time and place from the block where we lived and and some continue to live, where we live and where we are now in time, and collecting that and having that as a part of a display along with some other types of articles, perhaps from area newspapers, etc. So these are things that we're continuing to work on, but that's where we are, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that anyone may have about the project. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. I am Nick Linner, and I'm a Ward 5 based filmmaker, and I'm just very humbled to be here to be part of this morning. I think I am sharing my screen now, so if I am, I'm gonna go forward. Last year, I was greatly honored to be among the inaugural group of Humanities DC production grant recipients. And in my grant proposal, I had elaborated on an interest in the Florida Avenue Market Corridor, that region that's now presently known as Union Market. And what had struck me about that space was its very unique multiculturalism here in the region. I love that you could walk down, 4th Street and in a single block hear Spanish, Korean, Urdu, Mandarin, and really wanted to find a way to sort of cinematically unpack a small story about life in the market for these immigrant entrepreneurs. So with the requirements of the grant, I took on an advisor who's an urban studies professor at UMD, and with her, a co-producer who's a PhD candidate under her. And, as that happened, the scale of the project widened and started to feel, maybe it's unfair to say, but a bit more survey-like. We started planning to cast a pretty wide net and interview at least half a dozen business owners on camera. We're gonna plan to record a voiceover with a local historian, talk to members of the consumer community, and try to really sort of understand some pretty big issues of development and economic policy within the mayor's office, and unpack these ideas of gentrification in that specific region. And to be honest with you, it started to kind of grow in scale beyond the budget, and it also started entering into story territory I wasn't confident I was really the right person for. I am a transplant from New York City, and I didn't know if I was the best person to do the telling. So, then the pandemic hit and several things happened. My wife had a child in early March. There were some health complications, and we didn't want to potentially expose ourselves to the virus with the newborn at home. And so we pretty much had to pause any sort of field production for about 3 months. My co-producer had to largely extricate herself from the project for her own health reasons. And, my access to safely filming subjects in the market was, greatly reduced. So, there was a necessity to realign the project goals. And we were lucky in that before the pandemic, in the late autumn, early winter, we had begun filming 3 businesses: a South American business, a Central American business, and a South Asian business. And we realized that we could just stick with these particular subjects and follow them through part of the pandemic to see what happened to them in their businesses. And again, it wasn't ideal. Originally, we planned to work with an African business, an East Asian business, and represent sort of more of that market space. But at this point, we were really kind of stuck and at the mercy of the project, or the pandemic. So, yeah, the project became more of a long-term sort of verite documentary engagement in, heroes of mine like Frederick Wiseman or Barbara Koppel, that tradition. And it was decided that rather than focus on as many groups of people, we would focus on these smaller groups of people for a longer period of time, and that we would break the film into 4 chapters that would correspond with the 4 seasons of the year, and really add to sort of the length of our actual production time. So you can see the schedule's changed quite a bit. The film has grown quite a bit, and whereas we originally intended to finish shooting by June, we pretty much didn't wrap up until the end of September. So now I just want to talk briefly about some just changes aesthetically. Originally, the goal was to make each film frame feel dense. We wanted to have like a certain level of intimacy, both with our characters and with the market. So if you look at the top left frame, that gives you a sense of how we're framing a lot of The subjects within the film, if you look at the top right frame, you can see we intended to film interviews with sort of a deep depth of field and, you know, it's cliche, but make the market sort of a character in and of itself. But the reality is, once we did go back to filming, everything changed. And if you look at the bottom left, you can see now there was a greater distance from our subjects. And if you look at the bottom right frame, you can see you know, we were starting now to film on longer telephoto lenses from a greater distance, often outdoors, really softening the depth of field in the background and changing the aesthetic. And during Q&A, I'm happy to talk about sort of lensing and how we changed from a technical standpoint. The other big challenge was we needed to have good quality audio during a time when there was still a lot of mystery, when the virus was spiking in April, May here in the district, and we just didn't think it was safe to get close to any of our subjects, but we did want to be able to talk to them. And we knew that we'd have to rely on Zoom, but we also knew that the sound and picture from Zoom wasn't ideal. So the workaround there was to largely rely on B-roll for the images and basically send out sterilized remote audio packages that we would put into airtight containers, leave on people's doorstep. We'd conduct the interview via Zoom, but they would record themselves. Again, I'm more than happy during the Q&A to talk about that, but here's just sort of a sample of what the Zoom audio sounded like in the recording versus what we were able to gather, you know, using broadcast equipment. So, you know, that was one workaround that we found to be effective. And finally, finally, just some general takeaways. You know, because of the pandemic, the film all of a sudden had a very sort of clearly defined villain, you know, the virus itself. And this has presented a more defined arc to the story, produced sort of a greater connection between the filmmakers and the subjects. You know, the virus has significantly changed the way our world is operating. It's one of the defining moments of our lives. And of course, there will be many documentary pieces about it in the years to come, focused on victims, healthcare providers, politicians, etc. But I feel the specific angle of this film, looking at the virus through the eyes of immigrant small business owners and the struggles it's presented, are sort of hyper-specific. And we hope that it will be a valuable historical document. And finally, you know, the issue of change, development, gentrification with the area remains a subject in the film. And in many ways, the virus has very much accelerated these changes. So now they're sort of living as a backstory behind the virus, but they're present. And I think because of that, the whole storytelling process feels, you know, a bit more organic. So that's it. I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. So I'm going to jump in really quickly. So Rasha and Nick are two of my grantees under my portfolio. So I just want to point out, so Rasha referenced doing an online poetry festival, and she's kind of said it in passing, but that was huge. So as we know, we're talking about poetry slam, what is the best part about it? Being present and, you know, the face-to-face and seeing the energy and feeling the energy of everybody, you know, that. So being able to pull that off and it being successful was huge. I am hearing that from other grantees, from other organizations that have a poetry component. They reference that event. So I don't want that to be lost in taking something that is very much something that needs to be in person and putting it online and with our youth. That was a huge deal and it was very successful. And then for Nick, creating these packages and putting them on doorsteps. And so that not only took ingenuity, but it cost money. It cost money. Nick said, well, I had to replace my equipment because it wasn't waterproof. I was like, why do you need waterproof, Nick? He said, well, you have to be able to sanitize. And so being able to think of all of that and to really do that to get the projects done, that was huge. And so I want to point those two instances out where I was very much in awe of what lengths the grantees went to get things done. So I just wanted to point those two things out.
Thanks. So yeah, I'd like to also just make sure that I put it out there again that if anybody does have any questions, to go ahead and put those in the chat. But there's one thing that I did want to ask before we may run out of time here at the end. A lot of these changes that you all have made seem like in a lot of ways they weren't ideal, but they enhanced the project that you were working on in a lot of ways, or they made it more accessible to people. So, I'm wondering, what kind of came out of this pivot that you would retain for future public programs that you're working on? What about it was like maybe initially kind of a workaround or a stopgap, but you felt like there was something that came out of it you could continue to do in future iterations? Anybody can answer that.
If I could go first. I think the biggest takeaway or something that I will definitely utilize in the future is Zoom. It is so convenient to do interviews through Zoom. Like in the past, if we wanted to interview somebody, we would have to make travel plans and pretty much take most of the day to go shoot an interview. Or if somebody was coming into the studio to visit, you always have to worry about traffic. Parking's a nightmare. So the fact that I could do interviews over Zoom, because before the pandemic, I never used it. I may have heard of it, but I never, really thought about it. But the fact that I know that I could use Zoom now is a game changer. I'm so grateful for it. Let me be the spokesman for Zoom. I would gladly do so.
I mean, I can elaborate from that. I know that in the literary field and with other organizations that Split This Rock partners with, there's definitely a commitment and an awareness that we really should offer virtual options that allow people to participate, even if it's in like this hybrid model that some folks are talking about. Like as we move to a place where we can do in-person events again, how do we retain the kind of accessibility that's offered by having a virtual model? And how do we make sure that we continue centering accessibility services? So like captioning, like ASL interpretation, like making sure that we continue having other good practices, access documents, visual descriptions, as we're hosting these virtual components of events. Something that I'm thinking about a lot is how do we get into this next layer of depth? I was talking with a group of poetry organizations from across the country yesterday, and everyone has admitted to Zoom fatigue. And even though there's an amazing overabundance of like these tremendous readings with just these, like in my field, global class poets, like real stars, like people who are lineage holders and elders in some case that you might just never get to see in person, depending on where they were reading or performing and where you live. But at the same time, folks are like, I just can't go to 3 readings a night, 7 or 8 nights a week, right? There's just like only so much time you can fit in. And so I've been really thinking about which of the events that we host as we think forward for Split This Rock are going to be big public events where we make a big broad push and anyone can come, and which things are more intimate invitations where it's something that's crafted really for a specific group of people. And I just recognize the difference of feel that has with our like publicly broadcast events versus some of the intimate workshops that really are about like a long-term cohort of people.
So I guess until we get a few more questions through the Q&A, hopefully, I did have another question, and some of you certainly touched on this in your presentation, but I think there's some room for elaboration as well. I think that everybody kind of had that moment in March where you really had to reassess what you were doing, whether you were just starting out or where you were in the middle. And I'm wondering if there was, ever that moment where you felt like, okay, this just really can't happen. These obstacles are too great to overcome. And, once you, and I guess, like what you had to do, kind of mentally, organizationally to kind of move past that and say, we're going to keep going with this and do it in the best way that we can.
I think on our end, it came from a place of like one of my colleagues on the project really wants to preserve analog and things that are in person and less digital and less telecommunications focused. And so really finding this happy medium of like, okay, like we can achieve in-person gatherings safely. Like our cultural center has precautions in place. When people come and visit the exhibit in person when it opens, they have to participate in contact tracing. They have to wear a mask that covers both their nose and mouth. We have a limit to how many people can be in the space at any given time. But we did have to find a happy medium of like which events or which workshops that lead up to this exhibition are either mixed digital and in person or just in person, and who's going where and how they're traveling. So like, again, we really wanted to bring young people into the cultural center, but we ended up sending our art educators to them because that was the easiest thing to do in terms of travel and safety and just getting people to and from in a safe manner during COVID-19. But I think there was a bit of finding that happy medium of like digital versus in person and doing it safely.
At one of our check-in calls, I joked with Andrea. I felt like I was Job in the Old Testament at times. I had an inability to film my subjects in person. I had to move out of my office, which was close to the location where I was filming all of my material. My office then had to move here into my basement, which then flooded during the big storm. My co-producer had a family emergency and then a health problem. She had to leave the project, and we had a little baby at home. And it was just everything that could go wrong. We're months behind schedule, and I am thankful to HumanitiesDC for being flexible with that. But everything that could go wrong with this project really did. But those challenges out of those challenges, we did have this ability to sort of improvise, and that improvisation has really benefited the project in some ways, and that fluidity I think is important to what the final outcome will be.
Great. This question, might be for, so we have a, question from Lisa. She's asking, when did everyone feel like the pivot seemed inevitable?
I can jump in on this. I actually, before we even changed anything for Split This Rock's programming, I work with a Southern Regional Artists membership organization called Alternate Roots, and I serve on the board of that organization. At the time, Split This Rock was scheduled to host an early March gathering for that board, and they were going to be meeting at Split This Rock's offices. And even before the public state of emergency was declared in DC, and I don't know if some folks may be familiar with the National Writing Conference, AWP, that usually hosts more than 15,000 people every year, wherever it goes nationally. Split This Rock had to make a decision about whether we were going to travel to San Antonio, which, if folks might remember, was one of 3 quarantine zones for folks who had been traveling internationally, who were like held on a military base at that time, really early on in the pandemic in sort of February. And we had to make a call. I was scheduled to travel to San Antonio, like flight booked, hotel, everything. Our board chair was going to go with me to represent the organization. We'd paid a lot of money for a booth there. There were a lot of folks who were really sad and concerned about us not going. I knew people who did go. That was one of the last major events, like nationally even, one of the last major national conferences before there were nationwide shutdowns. So we decided not to go, and Split This Rock was considered sort of like, we talked to some of our other peer organizations and people were really split at that point. That was the first weekend in March, but we had to make the call like a week and a half earlier than that we weren't going to go. Yeah, there were definitely some folks who were really sad that, you know, people weren't going to gather and hug and really didn't want to give that up. And then other folks who were looking at the news internationally and really feeling scared. For my part, because we had a festival that was coming 3 weeks after that national conference, I was concerned about what would happen if, as an ED, I went there and then martial law was declared in the city because they had already had some leakage from people who'd been released from the quarantine center. And then made it out into the city, but hadn't received negative tests yet. And so were considered potentially still contagious. So I was concerned about being trapped in San Antonio 3 weeks ahead of our national festival. And of course, that's before we even made the decision about the festival. The following week, basically the week of that national conference, we decided that we were canceling our in-person event. And we did a lot of background conversation, and I canceled that board meeting that was supposed to travel to DC, and that was a hard thing to do. Folks really wanted to come, and I had to tell folks, I'm like, I made some impassioned pleas to people, and I was like, this might be some of the most important work we ever do in our lives. In all the work that we do is to try to keep our people at home, especially as cultural workers. I think maybe it's hard. We don't think of ourselves as like government leaders, but we're conveners in such major spaces, and we really influence, like, we have a lot of influence over the rhythms of people's lives. And so I take that really seriously. Yeah. So I was not one of the earliest voices. I definitely had friends who were much more worried about it sooner than me. But yeah.
Real quick, I see Linda asked me a question about the learning curve with learning different technology. I think the biggest learning curve is going back to Zoom. And this is kind of like a funny story. So one of my students was interviewing the CEO of Friendship, Patricia Brantley. So I've already set up the interview between them two. And, you know, I said, and then I exited out the Zoom to just let her do her thing. But what I didn't realize is that she didn't, like, it didn't give her the option to record on her own. Apparently you have to set her as the host, which we didn't realize at the time because we were still figuring out Zoom. But fortunately, our CEO was able to record on her end, and then she sent the recording to us. But it was kind of a bit of a panic mode because, you know, she's so busy with her schedule. I wasn't sure if we could, you know, do it over again, but it worked out. And we just took that as a kind of a learning experience. To be honest, it was like during this whole process, it was kind of like we were learning as we were doing. And through luck, it turned out okay. So we're very, you know, fortunate for that.
There's also a question in the Q&A about Humanities DC future grants and grant possibilities. And, you know, I'd say that, like, we haven't necessarily sat down and specifically talked about kind of how these adaptations and everything like that will affect future RFBs or future grant possibilities. But, you know, I think that, you know, and Andrea, you can feel free to, you know, kind of, you know, back me up or, you know, debate me on this. But, you know, I think that just based on what we've seen in terms of project directors being able to make such great use of these virtual technologies, you know, Zoom, and there's, you know, a number of public programming platforms that people have used, a number of techniques like Nick's discussed to, you know, do media projects and get interviews without, necessarily having to kind of be in person for everything. I think that, kind of knowing that all of these things are possible and that they can result in outstanding, effective public programming. In some ways, outstanding, effective public programming that can be done kind of more efficiently with less, travel costs and things like that. I think that kind of knowing that these things are possible and they can be implemented so well is something that, probably will impact the way we, kind of read those things or, work with our evaluators in future rounds as well. I think that, it's likely that more people will carry over these lessons into future public humanities programs. And I think that's something that we'll have to take into account as well.
Agreed. I also feel like some of our grantees that were in the process, their pivot included documenting their pivots. So outside of their story or what their original project was, to document how they pivoted, what their challenges were, how they faced them, and what was the end result of that, to be able to share that, because I think information sharing and knowledge sharing is important in this space. And so we've been afforded that opportunity to now have that documented. And I think we'll continue to keep our ear to the ground, like what is going on? How effective can we continue to be in our current grant programs and be able to change those as time goes on? Like right now, there's an increase in cases. So some of the schools are going back home. Some people never went back to their office. So what does that all look like? And I think we'll continue to assess that and see what works better for our grantees. Where is the need? I participated in a humanities conference last week, and it just talked about grant programs. What's the need? Grant programs can address that. So I think we'll continue to look at that, and all that depends on how, programs continue in this virtual space, how successful they are, all the platforms that are available, and then just how people continue to interact. So, we'll just be doing that constantly.
Rasha just posted in the comments, and I feel like I wouldn't be doing my role or public health justice without uplifting their comments. So please make sure you wear a mask that covers both your nose and mouth. And if you see someone who's not covering both their nose and mouth, you just give them a nice little, hey, your nose is showing, watch out. If you need to access COVID-19 testing, go to coronavirus.dc.gov. You can also email appointments at whitman-walker.org to access COVID testing. We also do HIV and STI testing, treatment and counseling. So call us at 202-797-4439 to access those services. And if you are looking to enroll in insurance, it's open enrollment time. Our insurance navigation team can help you. Call us at 202-745-6151.
Thank you. It's definitely important to have that information as well. And I'd like to thank, all of our panelists. Thank everybody who joined us this morning. It's been really great to share all of these, great ways that everybody's adapted. It's a sampling of outstanding grantees who have done this work. But, like I said at the beginning, we have had a lot of grantees who have all been trying to figure out these adaptations, in a lot of kind of creative ways of doing so. So also very appreciative of all the work that the public humanities community in DC has done to keep making these offerings available to all of us. So with that, I think that our time is up. Thanks again for joining us, and have a great rest of the conference.